Welcome to this Rochester Business Alliance webinar today. It's a nice snowy day that we have in Rochester, and we're glad that you're able to huddle around the fireplace and listen to our webinar today. We invite you to become our friend at Firestorm. Our Facebook account is Firestorm Solutions, and you can also follow us on Twitter, Firestorm Soul. And yes, there is a hashtag, and that hashtag is Crisis Coach. Firestorm transforms crisis into value and empowers you to manage risk and crises. Firestorm expertise is crisis management, critical decision support, crisis communication, crisis public relations, and consequence management. Keep in mind that the presentation that we're making today is not complete without the accompanying oral comments and discussion. Then the work product that is presented must be read in conjunction with your organization's personal counsel. In addition, this information should not be considered legal advice or legal opinion. The Rochester Business Alliance, along with Firestorm, are presenting the Crisis Coach webinar series. Today, we're discussing why assess workplace violence. Our presenter today is Harry Rulin, who is the chairman of the board of Firestorm, who has extensive and great experience in the workplace violence. He's been in the center of many responses that people have made to workplace violence and school violence. The webinar series is underwritten by the Rochester Business Alliance. Our good friend Chip Dawson is on today. And Chip, I'd like to turn it over to you for a few comments, please.
Thank you, Bill. Be happy to do that. And good morning, everyone. Welcome to the 14th in the series of the Crisis Coach. The Rochester Business Alliance, as always, is delighted to partner with Firestorm to bring you, our members, this critical 45-minute discussion by Harry covering the subject of workplace violence risk assessment. Workplace violence is something we prefer not to think about, but it makes news almost daily. It ranks fourth in the cause of workplace deaths, with 397 work-related homicides reported in 2013. 2 million workers report being victims of workplace violence each year. Many more cases, we know, go unreported. Whether it's physical violence, threats, verbal abuse, or other forms of bullying, it's all harmful, and it's all something that OSHA wants employers to prevent or control. OSHA has no magic answers to the problem. It's not the same as putting a guard on a machine, but the agency does have things that it expects all employers to do. Those expectations include risk assessment, a zero-tolerance policy, implementation of a workplace violence prevention plan, and putting engineering and administrative controls in place. Think CPTED here, crime prevention through environmental design. We start at the beginning of OSHA's list today with Harry's discussion of workplace violence risk assessment. Now here's Harry.
Thanks, Chip. That was a great introduction. And actually, I was surprised, when Bill was doing his introduction that he mentioned that it was snowing in Rochester today. Having graduated from Syracuse Law School, I know that it never really snows in that part of the world, so it was actually a surprise this morning. I know you guys have been suffering up there, so I'm really, when we talk about workplace issues and doing various types of assessments, one of the other ones that we do very often are the natural disaster type of assessments, and I know that most of your firms deal with this issue on a regular basis. So I'm really happy to talk to all of you today about workplace violence. And as Chip just pointed out, workplace violence is a huge issue, and it does not just encompass the physical threats that people see. So you heard Chip mention things like bullying. Well, the world has changed, and the rate of change that we see sometimes leaves a lot of employers behind in terms of assessing the risks that they have and that their employees have, and in making sure the appropriate controls are in place. So as we all know, you heard when Bill was doing his introduction, he talked about the fact that there are hashtags for this particular webinar that you can join us on Facebook, on Twitter. there are now technological innovations that both allow you as an employer to better monitor what's going on in your organization, but also that allows bullies to do things that they previously could not have done without the technology. Also, the technology gives you business intelligence that allows you to know when something is going on. So one of the things you're going to hear me talk about a little further on in the presentation is the fact that workplace violence is the leading cause of death for women in the workplace. Now, I'm sure very few of you employ women, so it may not be a problem, but it's so important to understand that domestic violence finds its way into the workplace. So one of the things you're going to see is that the people who come after these women in the workplace are typically family members. They're their spouse, their boyfriend, and I specifically mention women because it almost never happens in the reverse. So we'll talk a little bit more about that, but having the appropriate tools in place for monitoring social media, I mean, almost invariably, if somebody is having a problem outside of the workplace, you will know it through social media. So we'll talk more about that. You know, every day there are crises going on. There's some organization that has some type of a crisis going on right now, and they're a member of the Rochester Business Alliance. If you guys know that there's someone having a problem, reach out to them. You know, if certainly a Firestorm can help them in any way, we're happy to do that, because typically what's happened is they've had some kind of a risk-based event that they've not fully examined. They don't have a plan for it. Their ability to control or mitigate the outcome is much reduced because they don't have any planning in place. And what they find out is that it's not business as usual. It's business as unusual. And it's really, really difficult to manage a situation when you don't have the normal type of things going on that you would day to day. It really messes up your day-to-day operations, and it doesn't necessarily have to be something big. You know, to an outsider, it may not even seem like a crisis. But let me tell you, when it happens to you, when it happens to your people, to your organization, it is a crisis. So definitely something worth talking about. You know, Chip was mentioning some of the statistics about workplace violence. There are almost 400 deaths in 2013. And still 70% of workplaces have no formal workplace violence program. If you think about it, there are 1 to 2 workplace violence deaths a day somewhere in the United States on average. And most organizations don't have any type of planning in place. So 43% of the people and are threatened, and 24% of those attacks do not report the incident. So that's what Chip was referring to when he said that there are 2 million reported incidents. There are probably more like 3 million incidents. So it is a huge economic cost to all of your organizations, and it's fairly likely that all of your organizations have had some type of event either take place that was reported or that took place that wasn't reported. Interesting also, you know, one of the things we get asked by folks all the time is, you know, these plans cost a lot of money to put in place. All the type of things that Firestorm does, the vulnerability and threat analysis, the emergency response planning, the crisis communications training, you know, they're very expensive. What's the return on equity? Well, if you look at what the estimated cost of a workplace homicide is to an employer, that $850,000, it's pretty easy to say, to realize that it's a question of how much do you pay now versus how much do you pay later. And what I like to tell people is it's usually about an order of magnitude different. So I think this is just one example of the return on equity that you get. What we like to say is, what's the return on no investment? And this tells you what the return on no investment would be. So what constitutes workplace violence? You know, again, we think about, and I've just been talking about workplace homicides, but it goes, of course, way beyond that. And we've all seen this in various situations, whether it's in our actual employment or whether we see it on television or in different types of media presentations. But you have all kinds of psychological intimidation and harassment, obscene phone calls and threats. You know, the interesting thing is the way that OSHA OSHA looks at it, workplace violence is determined by the person perceiving it. So when we talk about psychological intimidation, if you have someone in your organization that's telling off-color jokes, for example, and the individual perceiving it perceives that in a violent way, that is workplace violence. And we can poo-poo it all we want, but realistically, that individual has a cause of action against the employer for not properly monitoring, controlling, and training its employees. You know, it's easy, obviously, on the physical side when we talk about the beatings, the rapes, the shootings, the stabbings. Those kind of things are, you know, much easier to look at and say, yeah, I get it, that's workplace violence. But it's important to understand that there does not have to be a physical touching in order for it to be considered violence. So there are lots of ways that we combat workplace violence. And as you heard in the introduction, I think this is our 14th webinar or somewhere along that line in this series. So you've all heard the Firestorm predict, plan, perform model. And at all of those different stages, there are opportunities to combat and prevent workplace violence. On the predictive side, I know some of you do background checks on your employees. Now, interestingly, we've done a lot of work. Firestorm's been doing a lot of work on this in the last 6 months, because what we have found out, and which was very disturbing, is that background checks are not all the same. What we found out is that the sexual offender database does not capture a tremendous amount of information. It does not, it for the most part is good at capturing federal crimes. But if someone is arrested and charged in a county court or a state court and is not found guilty in those locations, there's almost no record of it. So sometimes, depending on where your facility is located, the way in which you do background checks may actually require a separate state and county check in order to determine the type of people that you're getting. Also, one of the things that I really want to emphasize to employers is, if you're doing background checks, and if you're not, to think about doing them, do a DMV check. It is the easiest check in the world to do, even if you don't have these people driving for you. If you find out that Joe Smith has had 6 road rage tickets and has had 2 drunk driving incidents, that might be something you want to know. So, and it certainly may be something you want to know before you hire them, but it may be something you want to know even after you've hired them. It also gives you, you know, if it's something that started happening recently, it gives you a window into Joe's life that might allow you to get him help. And it may prevent a workplace violence incident from occurring on your property. So I really encourage you to think about that simple check for all of your employees. Behavioral risk and threat assessment. This is something that Firestorm refers to as BERTHA, and it's something that we've literally spent the last year intensively working on. Because what we've realized, you know, one of the things we get asked by organizations when we respond to workplace violence incidents is, how could we have prevented this? How do we stop this madness from occurring? You know, you think about the fact that there were 400 deaths in 2013. There were 40 school shootings in 2014. And when I tell people those numbers, you know, it's always staggering. People just can't understand it. And the question we get asked is, how can we stop this madness? And I think the answer is that there are almost always behavioral signs that people exhibit before they perpetrate these behaviors that are ignored. And the reason that they're ignored is one of 2 things. Either our employees aren't trained how to spot them, or the employees are aware of them and don't know how to report them. So having appropriate behavior of concern training and having a system in place at your organization where people can report, hopefully anonymously, but even if they can't, that they know that there's no retribution for reporting and they know how to report it. It is absolutely so important. And of course, that brings you into that plan circle that you see on the screen. Developing comprehensive plans and communicating those plans, doing the training and the education, I mean, so important, and it's the way that you're going to protect your employees, protect your business, and not encounter situations that are extremely costly. You know, one of the things in that $850,000 cost to organizations that we didn't talk about is the damage to brand and reputation, is the damage to employees going forwards. Because after a major workplace violence incident, almost all employers experience a significant amount of employees over the course of the following 2 years that leave that employer and go to work somewhere else. Because subconsciously those people don't feel safe in that environment. They're looking to get out of that job. And we all know how good it is, or how difficult it is to find good employees. We can't afford to lose them for a reason like this. So, as I'm sure you can imagine, there are lots of legal issues that arise from workplace violence and workplace violence-related planning. It is the legal responsibility of an employer to safeguard employees against preventable and foreseeable harm. And as Chip pointed out, the workplace violence is absolutely one of those things that OSHA has identified as a preventable harm. There are all kinds of tools that can be put in place. There's all kinds of training and education. Also, the employer has an obligation to respect an employee's rights during the investigative and disciplinary process. So I think this is one of the reasons that a lot of workplace violence doesn't get looked into or doesn't get examined closely, is employers are worried about violating people's privacy. But keep in mind, there's privacy on both sides, and there's obligations on both sides, both the victim and on the alleged perpetrator. So yes, you do want to get human resources involved. You want to get potentially your corporate counsel involved in these situations, but that doesn't mean that they can be swept under the rug. They have to be looked at. They have to be looked at intensively and very carefully. As I said already, OSHA has, and most states have identified workplace violence as an exposure that has to be looked at. Typically, when the suits come in against an employer for workplace violence, it's under various theories of negligence, and usually all of them. Any of you who have been involved in litigation of any kind probably know that, you know, there are, the way that a complaint is written is with multiple theories. So, you know, they're going to talk about the negligent hiring. So, they're, again, going back to that background check issue, if that person had things in their background you could have known, obviously there's going to be the allegation that you should have done that. You know, that you negligently supervised, that you kept people on even when you knew that they had a propensity. You know, those kind of things are going to come up, and they're going to come up regularly in litigation if you haven't dotted your I's and crossed your T's. And again, this comes back to that overall workplace violence plan and preparation. You know, so even before we get to the planning stage where we're actually putting in place a workplace violence plan, you've got the predictive aspect of it. You know, again, there are various types of employers on this phone call today. I know some of you have drivers, for example, that are driving trucks. I would imagine, no, I know that all you're doing the background checks to make sure not only DMV, but that they've got their commercial licenses and all of that, and that they don't have any kind of restrictions against them, those kind of things. But you'd be surprised how many times we see when we go to look at workplace violence or other type of situations that those checks haven't been updated, that the person who was supposed to be doing the annual reviews hasn't been doing them. A lot of times the reason those things occur is because there is no plan in place. There's no documentation. There's no structure that makes sure that those kind of mistakes aren't made. So a big part of the workplace violence process, again, is going to be structure. Now, recently, there have been some courts that have said that there will be criminal liability against the organization for serious injury or death to employees. It's a very disturbing trend in the courts and in the legal profession, because obviously, typically, it has only been individuals that have been held criminally liable in situations. So just something to be aware of. And again, it depends. I know a lot of you also, while you may be based in Rochester, are not just Rochester organizations. You have subsidiaries that you in various states and other locations, and that's going to require an understanding of that state statute as well. You know, one of the things with workplace violence is it's part of the overall disaster picture, and one of the terms I know you've heard us use in the past when we're talking about anything that Firestorm does is the concept of disaster denial. You know, it can't happen to me, it's not going to happen here, it won't be that bad. It's what helps us get through day-to-day life. But the reality is, it's not that it's impossible. Obviously, we all know, just from the conversation we've been having today, workplace violence is not only possible, it's probable. There are going to be 1 to 2 workplace violence deaths today somewhere in this country. And we just can't imagine. It's unthinkable that it would happen on our property with our people. But it does happen. It happens every day. And, you know, it's interesting that Dan Brown quote you see on the bottom of the screen, you know, that denial is a critical part of the human coping mechanism. It's absolutely true. I mean, if we had to think about all the things that could happen to us today, we wouldn't get out of bed, because you wouldn't be able to manage the stress, the anxiety, the fear that would create. So it's okay, you know, we all need that bit of denial, but not in this situation. As managers, as executives in organizations that are responsible for the welfare of our people, we have an obligation to make sure that we eliminate or mitigate as many of these type of threats as possible. You know, this is an interesting new slide. This is actually what our booth that we take to some of the trade shows that we go to looks like. And it says, can you identify your organization's next crisis? We can. Now, this has been an issue of big contention amongst the founders at Firestorm, because one of us has asked the question, well, how can we take the position that we can identify someone's next crisis? And the reality is, after significant discussion, I think we're all on the same page, that in fact we can. In fact, you can. You may not know exactly which of the items you identify is going to happen first, but most of the threats that your organization, I would say pretty much all of the threats that your organization is subject to, you can sit in a room with your senior management team, and in a half an hour, if you guys put your threats up on the whiteboard, what are the things that keep you up at night? What are the things that can go wrong? You will have a list of the things that you need to be examining and planning for, and in that list will have been your organization's next crisis. Now, realistically, by doing that process and by doing the planning and putting in place the procedures to manage those situations, you've probably averted your organization's next crisis. And that, of course, is the process that we're trying to get all of you to participate in. And if you need us to come in and help you facilitate that kind of a discussion, obviously we're happy to do that. But you don't need us. You can get this process going on your own, and you can do it for any individual threat. You know, so as far as workplace violence is concerned, the great thing about it is you've got the opportunity to call your staff together next Thursday. You know, you can put it on the calendar. You can do it when it works and get it moving forward. You know, you've seen the pictures in different presentations we've done of the calendar and the clock, where we talk about the fact that right now we're on the calendar, we have time to plan. Well, let's use that time before we do get on the clock. You know, this was just what I was telling you about. Can you really predict the crisis? The answer is absolutely. I mean, we regularly, every spring, get called by organizations in Tornado Alley who have their warehouse, their factory, their office building has been wiped out by a hurricane, by a tornado. We get it with hurricane season as well, and earthquake as well. And we're like, okay, well, have you implemented your tornado plan? And they look at us like we've got two heads, and they say, what tornado plan? Well, if I asked any one of you, can we talk about your winter weather plan and your snow and ice, how you're dealing with employees not being able to get to work? Do you have a telework program so that you can continue an operation? How are you dealing with critical supply chain issues because you have a major snowstorm? Hopefully that's the kind of risk, because it happens so often, that you all have dealt with. Well, workplace violence is no different. Those warning signs are all there, but the difference may be that you don't know what the indicators are. You don't understand those behaviors of concern. That's okay. We do. We can help you with that and are more than happy to do so. Also, there's a tremendous amount of information that you can get from OSHA, from outside business organizations, from doing a little bit of research online. So lack of knowledge is not a reason not to be doing this type of planning. One of the things I referred to earlier was the issue of social media and business intelligence. There is a tremendous amount of information that is now available because of technology. Because of social media, you can know what's going on in the lives of your employees and your community. And if you know what's going on out there today, you're going to know what potentially could happen tomorrow. Going back to that whole predictive issue, if you know that there's some type of serious adverse situation going on in one of your employees' lives, you can get that person the assistance that they need. And similarly, you can put your other employees on notice that there's a potential for a problem. We've all seen this, whether personally or in the movies or anything else. The woman comes to work wearing the dark sunglasses, and she's got a black eye from a fight that she had with her husband. Well, typically people try to ignore that. They try to minimize it. They don't report it to human resources. Remember, the leading cause of death in the workplace for women is spouses or boyfriends coming to work and killing them. And when they do that, there's always collateral damage. It's not usually clean where it's only that individual. So it's so important that your employees understand the reporting requirements that are necessary to manage and mitigate those type of risks. And the only way that that's going to happen in your organization is by having a detailed workplace violence program. So we've already talked about predicting. We're going to understand what the threats and the vulnerabilities are. It's interesting. As I talk about behaviors of concern. In the school environment, 78% of shooters who come back to school with a gun felt bullied, persecuted, or threatened by others. Now think about that. We're not talking about the person who was the bully. We're talking about the one who was bullied who now becomes the perpetrator. Keep in mind, all of those people who were bullied in school, by the way, there are about 2.2 million incidents of bullying in schools on an annual basis. So very similar to the number of workplace violence reported incidents. Where do those bullies go after they graduate from high school or college? They're your employees now. Their behavior doesn't necessarily change. So again, workplace violence finds its roots in the same places that school violence finds itself. So it's important to understand that it's not necessarily the bully in your organization that becomes your workplace violence problem. It could very well be the person who was being bullied. And again, knowing those behaviors of concern, being able to spot them, being able to spot the individual who starts behaving oddly. You know, you've probably all seen these workplace violence situations on TV where when they interview coworkers, someone comes back and says, oh yeah, you know, Joe started acting really weird these last few weeks. You know, he used to be outgoing and come to all the ball games and started sitting by himself and he was always brooding. And those kind of situations, because people knew them but didn't know what to do with them, are the ones that are really sad because there was an opportunity to intervene. I talked a lot already about background checks, so I'm not going to go through a lot of the stuff that's on this slide. But again, it is so critical that you be doing background checks just for the information that you may get. I mean, again, proactively in hiring, wonderful. Annually on employees to say, okay, what's changed in their lives? Spectacular. I mean, really can make a huge difference in your process. You know, one of the things also, I referred to this earlier, but it's again here on this slide. You want to catch workplace violence when it's all the way down at the bottom of the spectrum. You want it to be at the point where it's a behavior of concern, where somebody is doing something or exhibiting something that we can get involved with. I know a lot of you have employee assistance programs, and those EAPs very often will have psychologists, mental health professionals, others who will get involved, people who will help with drug and alcohol issues. That's another thing to keep in mind, that typically in any population, somewhere between 10 and 20% of the people have drug or alcohol-related problems that they bring to the workplace. When you compound that with spousal and other issues, you realize that the potential for escalation up this spectrum goes up, you know, significantly. You start with behaviors of concern. You see those behaviors of concern, but then the behavior starts to change. It becomes threatening behavior. It doesn't take long necessarily before it becomes physical injury or death. So we want to catch it right at the bottom. But the only way that that's possible is by having a very detailed program with training in place. And again, I can't emphasize enough, having a system for reporting that everybody understands, and understands that not only is it not, you know, tattling, but it's an expected behavior to keep the organization and all the employees safe. So when we talk about behaviors of concern, there are various things we have seen with workplace violence, shooters especially, that are red flags. We're not going to go through all these. We could talk about this one slide for a long time. But in terms, and there are many, many more behaviors of concern that we can talk about, but there are ways to know who are your potential perpetrators. And also, it's not just behaviors, but it's changes in behavior. Those are real red flags. Those are warning signs that everybody wants to be aware of. And, you know, one of the things that we get all the time is, well, what's foreseeable? How do we know what's coming and what we should be doing something about? Well, one of the problems is, in today's world, again, going back to that issue of technology and what's information is available, almost everything is foreseeable. Like I said, you can sit down in your conference room with your people and a whiteboard and pretty much identify all of your vulnerabilities and exposures. My guess is, if you bring in the right people, you can also identify those individuals within your organization who are most likely to cause you workplace violence and other types of human resource-related problems. And if that is in fact the case, if what I just said is correct, that you can identify them, then I think you can understand the accountability for you and for your organization is fairly significant. So I think establishing that intelligence network that I referred to earlier, in other words, making sure you have a social media monitoring program in place. I mean, that's a new thing for most employers. A lot of you do have anonymous reporting. Some of you have it through text message, email, other tools. One of the things that I've seen done in organizations that don't have that available, where they've got more of a manufacturing type of environment where people don't necessarily have a computer with them all day, or don't allow personal cell phones to be used on the factory floor, things like that. But what they do have is a suggestion box, which is a very useful tool, because as long as it's set up in the right way and everyone understands what it's for, and it can be used for both positive things and negative things. You know, I want to change in the lunchroom menu, or, hey, Joe is beating up on Mary during the lunch hour. I mean, as long as I can put any message I want in that box, and that box is checked on a regular basis, that can be a very useful and successful tool, not very expensive, and very effective in terms of knowing what's going on within your particular facility. I've actually been in one organization that has the suggestion boxes in the bathroom. They have a box. They have the paper and pencils in the stalls, and the box by the door as you leave. So I thought it was very creative, and they get a lot of really significant input from people in that environment. So to say that you can't put in place anonymous reporting is just not correct. It sometimes just requires a little bit of ingenuity. Social media monitoring plan, that we can help you with. Don't try and reinvent that wheel. There are providers who can help set that up, and we have that pretty much dialed at this point. So anyone who'd like to have that kind of a discussion, definitely reach out for Chip, who can direct you to someone at Firestorm who can help you, or you can reach directly out to Bill. But we'll give you some numbers and things at the end of the presentation. And then I referred earlier to Bertha, behavioral threat and risk assessment. You need to have as part of your program, as part of your workplace violence program, a behavioral threat and risk assessment process, where when those behaviors of concern are in fact identified, someone in your organization knows what to do with them. So, you know, the business intelligence risk watch, we've talked about it. We want to know that your employees, your safety, your reputation, that all of those things are being protected. You know, when we talk about social media risk program, obviously there are lots of components to it, but again, this is not a wheel you should attempt to reinvent on your own. And this is not something that is as simple as saying, oh yeah, we've got a Facebook page and someone from Human Resources is watching it. That's not what we're talking about here. What you need to know is what's being said about you, about senior management, about your organization, by whom, where is your brand and reputation exposed, and in situations where we do have identified employees or issues with spouses, that we are in fact monitoring that information as well. We definitely want to be monitoring for negative comments that are being made by employees. So for example, there's a very, very large client of Firestorm that just this week, they operate online retailing, and they, as you can imagine, this past week and this coming week have a tremendous amount of stress in their warehouses and in their factories as a result of the Christmas season. And their social media monitoring program picked up on 2 individuals in 2 different states, in 2 different warehouses, that were making threats against their coworkers and against the organization, which would not have been known but for their social media monitoring program. So again, it's the kind of thing that everybody needs to have in place. And after an event, if you don't have it in place, you can be sure that the plaintiff's attorneys are going to say, how could you not have been doing this? Look what you could have known had you had this in place. You know, we want to listen to what's being said and by who. On the threat and risk side, you know, one of the things we almost always find with threats and risks is somebody new. Someone knew that Bob was bringing that gun to work. Someone knew that Bob was being bullied. And invariably, nobody said anything. We need that behavioral risk and threat assessment process to be in place to prevent those things from happening. You know, I can't stress enough that whole process. And then you see at the bottom of this particular slide, the case management and the monitoring. You know, after we have, in fact, identified the individuals and gotten them the assistance that they need, how are we making sure that those situations are de-escalating? Again, that comes back to the case management and the monitoring. This slide was, again, this is one of those slides that I could go through with you for an hour on its own. I mean, we could have a separate webinar just about this slide. But again, realizing what the process is, a big part of containing these risks and making sure that they're properly managed is having a process, knowing what the flow is, knowing whose responsibility it is to do what piece, and what do we do when someone is at a level of concern that's a low, a medium, a high, and how does that trigger the various pieces of our plan. So again, it's a very important process. We are happy to assist in any way that you need us to. We can get you started. We can participate in the process. We can guide. We can actually lead the process. But if you don't have this in place in your organization, please reach out. Let us help. If you do have it in place and you're confident that it's been done well, let us come in and do a gap analysis so that we can see that it in fact is meeting best practices. Let's do a test exercise, because you need to be doing that anyway. The only way you know whether any of your plans are going to be effective, the way that we find the gaps in all of the programs, even from the largest employers nationwide, is to do those test exercises. Because the things that you find, the failures that you find, you know, we recently did a test exercise where we were looking at, we did a test exercise where an employee needed medical assistance. They needed an AED because they had had a heart attack as part of a larger exercise. And when the person went to get the AED, what they realized is the AED was behind a locked door. And they never would have known that if they hadn't done the test exercise, because everyone says, oh yeah, we've got an AED, it's over there, you know, in the West Wing. So those are the kind of things, if you really want to find the flaws in your program, we've got to be doing test exercises. Again, behaviors of concern, I'm not obviously going to try and go through with you all of the different things that can be identified as part of the warning signs for serious situations developing at your organization. But they are knowable. They are the kind of things that can be trained, they can be taught. They're the kind of things that you may not really have paid attention to, or, as we talked about earlier, they're the kind of things that you thought were private. You know, you see Mary sobbing at lunch, sitting by herself in the corner. You want to give her her space. You want to give her her privacy. Well, you know what? As an employer, that may not really be an opportunity that you have. You've got an absolute responsibility to understand what's going on in Mary's life that Mary may bring to your workplace. So, you know, knowing how to analyze those threats, knowing whether they are really a low, a medium, or a high, it's very important. So, you know, having a preparedness program that's based on a framework that has the overarching policies, that has defined goals, all of those things. I mean, you've heard us talk about this, whether we're talking about the creation of an emergency response plan, a crisis communications plan, or a workplace violence plan. It's all done the same way. So that being said, we're at our 45-minute mark, and I know, Bill, we may have a question or two, and I think we can take a couple of minutes if we do. Were there any questions that people brought up, Bill?
No questions at this point. If anyone does have a question, you may enter it into the typewritten area. Thank you.
Yeah. Now, so there's a lot of slides that I could have gone through. You know, again, there's a lot more information in this type of a situation, but I wanted to give Chip a chance to talk about some of the upcoming events that they've got on their health and safety agenda at the Rochester Business Alliance. So, Chip, I think you can probably see that on your screen now, so you might want to just
I can, Harry. I can, Harry.
Why don't you jump in and cover that?
Thanks, I'll do that. A lot of stuff is going on with OSHA next year, and we have a briefing tomorrow morning, in fact, at the Business Alliance from 8 to 9. It's free to all of our members, and we'll tell you about all the new rules for 2015, including in there will be some information about workplace violence, what OSHA's initiatives are. And then following up on that, next Tuesday afternoon, or morning rather, we have OSHA record keeping. I'm sorry, those are actually afternoon programs. I don't know how we got that in that way. Next Tuesday afternoon and Wednesday afternoon, we have OSHA record keeping and chemical hazard communication that follows on from the OSHA initiatives for next year. Those are areas where OSHA is going to pay a lot of attention. So all somebody has to do if they want to go to any of these programs is go to the RochesterBusinessAlliance.com and look at the calendar, and you'll get the information there. And Harry, let me think.
Tell me again, Chip, what time are those things on Tuesday?
Those are actually, those are in the afternoon, and somehow I erred in putting that together. And No, they're both in the afternoon, starting at 1 o'clock on Tuesday and Wednesday, running until 4:30.
Great.
So Harry, thank you very much for your program today, and to you and Bill and all of our listeners, very happy holidays from me and the Rochester Business Alliance.
Well, to everyone in Rochester as well, and I'm a little jealous of the fact that you guys are going to have a white Christmas. Unfortunately, here in Colorado, we are having an extreme drought, and we would normally have had a white Christmas as well. But we haven't seen any precipitation in about a month. I don't mean to make you jealous, but it's not a good situation, even though it may sound that way.
We're all pulling the violins out here, Harry.
Thanks, Chip. You guys have a great holiday, and we look forward to our next presentation with you guys.
Great. Bye-bye.
Bye.